Okay, so intro to people on the internet, because you all know who I am, but they might not. So this is going to be a talk about code licensing just in general and what it means for us as developers. It tries to cover as much as possible in like some pretty vague-ish terms, because it's not trying, first up here, I'm not a lawyer, I don't know all of this stuff in like real sense. I just happen to have a lot of open source code out there and happen to run a dependency manager where like licensing is extremely important, because any large scale change there could affect like every single app in the ecosystem. So we care about this kind of stuff. So the best resources for like getting a ton of information for this is the website choosealicense.com that's run by GitHub. There was a time period where GitHub didn't do any pushing towards people getting custom licenses or having any license at all. And we'll go into that a bit later, but like this is a simple website that will give you an overview of everything. That's usually like 2 or 3 sentences for each one. It's nice. And then TLDR legal is like the equivalent, but for like very like it's a much more intense version of this. Instead of a few sentences, it's more like multiple paragraphs, and being able to understand like what are the real ramifications when they say like this is sub-licensable. We'll go into that too also. So we're going to talk about 3 types of licenses in general. There is the permissive licenses, which is the MIT BSD. These are the things that everybody generally uses here, and people use around the world nowadays. For example, that's jQuery, Rails, CocoaPods, and all artsy stuff. We'll talk a little bit about the mostly permissive stuff. This is the Apache is probably the most famous one, the Mozilla public license being like the second, but you don't see that much. So that's Subversion and Firefox and things like that. And then finally we got like the copyleft and the viral viral licenses, and that's things that are like Linux, Git, WordPress. So the idea that if you include this code, suddenly you are now actually going to be involved in having to use that same license yourself. So one of the interesting things about looking for all these different licenses and actually spending a bit of time studying all of them means that they all come with one important thing, and that is there's no warranty and a disclaimer of liability on the person who has created the library. This is super important because this is actually the way in which anybody can build software in the open, because what you're saying there is that the relationship between me as a library author and you as a library consumer is that you can't really claim that I broke your stuff if you're using my library. And that is super important. So one of the best examples that I could probably think of around this is this year we've had a bunch of like really big vulnerabilities that have caused nearly every server to like have to like update their SSH keys, or Bash, for example, had a thing called shell shock that meant that every single person had to update their Mac or update their servers because Bash was easily exploitable to get root access. What none of us ever did was we sued the people that worked on Bash, or we sued the people that worked on like the SSL certificate checking in OpenSSL. There was no liability for the people that wrote this code and gave it to you in order for you to feel like, not only was it their fault, but we're losing monetary value and we have to like have a recourse from that. That is part of the common things in every single license, like the absolving yourself as the author from responsibility from what people do with it. So on the subject of responsibility, one of the default things when you create PUBIC domain right? Ally was chuckling about that, and I couldn't find it when I did a search, so still there. One of the few interesting things about a public domain is that, like, by default, when you are putting code out, it does not have a license because you did not, like, when you created a project, it might not have come with a license by default. And so what that means is if there is not a license at all, like you have chosen for like a repo or for some type of code, then it falls straight into like default copyright, which is the same code of copyright that you make when you write a blog post or when you do pretty much any kind of creative thing. Anything that you're creating is effectively copywritten by you. This is not very useful in the sense of like relying on other people's things. So if you are like shipping code that has no license, which means it's copyright, then there is no relationship between you and the consumer of your library. What this means in practice, though, is that like if you start relying on someone's public domain code, the person who owns the public domain code has copyright and can do whatever they want. So effectively, they could revoke the license. They could like actively sue you for just using the code that they've put there. Like, it's not common practice, and I don't think anyone's ever done it. But like, there is no agreement between like the person shipping the code and the person reading the code. So common practice is when you write a blog, then you put that your stuff in this blog is like Creative Commons, and we'll go into Creative Commons later. But like, every time you are doing a Stack Overflow copy and paste, you are not taking public domain work. The moment that you post any code on Stack Overflow, it is defined as, I think it might be Creative Commons. I did look this. Creative Commons. I think it's CC0. But basically speaking, like the most common times when you like are copying and pasting code from someone, it's probably either been like Creative Commons, which is useful but not great for code licensing, but like otherwise it is the Stack Overflow one, which is what most people are doing. So it's very rare that you find public domain code on the internet, roughly speaking, because GitHub now do a pretty good job of like encouraging people to never write public domain code on GitHub. This is because it's totally in GitHub's interest to not have public domain code on their website, because even for GitHub, they have to have a specific part of their terms and services that say that if you upload code without a license, we are going to grant ourselves a license in order to allow people to use it, to like fork it, and then once it's forked, then they can put their own license on it. And like, in order for GitHub to even feel safe of anybody uploading any code, they have to have that sort of thing in their terms of services. So it won't be like included inside your repo, but like that is part of the explicit terms and services of using GitHub. Whew. Okay. So there is this concept among code licenses that there is what's called OSI approved licenses and not OSI approved licenses. So when you talk about something like the MIT, BSD, GPL, Apache, what you're really talking about is a license that has been submitted to a standards body called the OSI, which I think is just the Open Source Initiative. Yeah. And they have like tried to find loopholes in this, tried to find like ways in which this could break and like put the author in a position where they probably didn't want to. And is then effectively becomes defined as an OSI approved license. Chances are you'll very, very rarely see licenses that are not OSI approved. Probably the biggest non-OSI approved license that you see around the internet is the WTFPL license, which is this idea that you can do what the hell you'd like with the code, but the OSI, like, you can just go and look at their debate about what the WTFPL is, and they basically state that it is more or less the exact same as public domain works. So, for example, at Artsy, when we were doing a check to see what all the licenses for all our dependencies were on for the mobile team, we found that there was at least one library that used WTFPL, and so we just politely asked them to like change it to be MIT or BSD. Specifically so that at this point right now we know exactly what the code is and exactly what it is, and we know the author personally, but had we not, then we would have been in a situation where the author could have made changes to the licensing and we would have had to like pay that price in the future without knowing. So had it switched to GPL, then suddenly we've got GPL code within our application, and I'll talk about GPL a bit later too. Whew. Okay. So everybody's favorite type of licenses are the permissive licenses. And this is generally what you think of when you say, I want to do some open source. Most people work either under the BSD license or the MIT license. And roughly speaking, they are the least restrictive on the relationship between the library author and the library consumer. They say that you can make changes, edits, amends, forks. You can take someone else's and put it under a new license, give it a new name, and that's fine. That's all totally acceptable within the license, and that gives a lot of freedom to the person who is actively using or may want to contribute back to the library. And that's generally why it's considered business friendly, because there's other ones that we'll get into further that have like clauses around some of these issues. And really, like, I'm pretty happy with us always using MIT and BSD. And the one thing that it does like politely require of you is that you give acknowledgements. There's a really great example that happened this year where Microsoft released their version of Objective-C. So it was them trying to create the entire of the Apple toolchain on Windows. And that is totally fine. So what they did was they went and took maybe 5 or 6 separate projects that were all attempts at trying to re-implement the kind of toolkit for the Apple stuff into Windows. But what they did was they actually just removed all the copyrights and removed all the licenses from maybe these 6 separate projects and then just jammed it all into one project. And so they broke basically the only thing that you need to care about when working with these licenses, because they were all licensed under permissive licenses, which was you have to give like attribution. So there are you can definitely remix this stuff, but you still need to say that the code for this bit came from this person. And that's like really, really like nice. It's not much. It's just being polite in general. So moving on from like the permissive licenses, there's like, I was calling them like patently permissive. So something like the Apache license and the Mozilla public license basically say that it's totally permissive, anyone can do what they want, but we also reserve the rights to create patents based off the work that we have done in the open here. And that's really the major difference between something like MIT BSD and Apache. It's never something that like we've ever felt at Artsy that we needed to do, right? I don't know. I've never tried to write a patent. I don't think any of my code would be patentable, really.
So the code is not patentable.
But it's the ideas of the code, right? Yeah.
The code can be used as an example in the patent argument, and you file code along, and that usually comes up if that code was under one license or another.
So roughly speaking, to the audience, like code can be part of the patent, basically. And so it's valuable in that respect. And then we have the viral. This was the original kind of license, the original GPLs. It was like from the 60s that kind of still reflects the ideas of the 60s. Like, yeah, yeah, it does. Like the idea of the free software foundation's ideas of how like they consider the GPL to be more free than the permissive licenses, because what it does is it enforces everybody to start releasing everything related to the code. So the idea of the GPL is that if you include any GPL code in your code base, roughly speaking, then everything else has to end up being GPLs, which is why they're called viral licenses, because you get one bit in there and then suddenly it spreads to all the other parts of the system. There are 2 major versions of the GPL that people still use right now. There's version 2 and version 3. There's a bunch of smaller differences around how the definition of system that your code is touching changes. But the really interesting aspect for me was that GPL GPL3 allows sublicensing, and GPL2 doesn't allow sublicensing. And what sublicensing is it says that I will grant a specific entity the right to have a different license to this code. So that's how you can get like commercial versions of WordPress. That's how you can get so I got a good example of this, right? So the artsy open source apps, we think about the ideas that maybe someone could try and copy them and put them on the app stores, or that like maybe a competitor will bootstrap based on our iOS apps. And we still released all of them under the MIT license, whereby to some extent they are free to do that at will. From our perspective, that's not so much of a problem because we have client keys and we have ways of like actively turning off apps, and therefore by making it pretty useless. But had we gone with, we are like super paranoid about other people reusing these apps, we could have gone with the GPL free for our applications and granted Artsy specifically our own license to do whatever we want. So that means that anybody else that wants to consume our applications would be under a different license from the one that we are as a company. This is useful because it means that they can't put it on the App Store, and that they have to ask us for requests, because for a custom license to be able to do, in order to not show the source code for the things that they're changing. So you can actually treat it as like a defensive tool with like GPL version 3. Okay.
There's another name for the viral license, polluting license.
Another name for the viral license is a polluting license. That's a pretty good one too. So those are the three like OSI approved like types of licensing. There is the permissive, there's permissive plus patents, and then there's viral or pollutant. There is also then a way of like licensing content per se via Creative Commons, and occasionally you do see people releasing code under the Creative Commons. So the Creative Commons is this idea that you are relinquishing copyright to some extent and creating an agreement to how people can reuse and mix and modify the thing that you have created. So normally you see Creative Commons works on photos, on videos, on like bodies of text like books or blog posts, but like the Creative Commons licensing is built to be extremely simple and like you know human readable and like lawyer readable, and so it doesn't cover a lot of like the sort of things that you have to deal with when you're dealing with source code. So the OSI don't recommend using Creative Commons, and Creative Commons don't recommend using Creative Commons for code. It's just a way in which you can like have some of the like resources inside your projects under the Creative Commons. So for example, in CocoaPods, all the design work is done under Creative Commons, and like so is all the content of like guides and documentation. But the actual code itself is all done under MIT BSD, because you can't really put like a design file into a source code license. I mean, it probably is covered by default, but it's just it doesn't feel right really. Whereas like the source code itself feels like it should be done under like a real source license. So that's where the distinction between like Creative Commons and like OSI approved licenses like MIT BSD, Apache, GPL all kind of come from. Okay, so I asked on Twitter earlier for some questions and answers, and I got some really interesting ones. Can I relicense a library after I have done this? And in order to really explain this, it's really nice stories about this. So to get go, if you've ever had to sign a like contributors license agreement, a CLA, in order to actively like work on a project, so what you are doing there is you are giving away the copyright of your work to the project owners. So if you make a contribution back to like an artsy library, you actually own that contribution. It's like assigned to, it's like your copyright. Like the PR and the code that is represented inside that is owned by the person who's contributed it, not the person that owns the library. And the CLA is there specifically to reassign that copyright from the person contributing it to the person owning it. So, for example, VLC is a very well-known media player, and about 2 years ago they wanted to ship an App Store app with VLC inside it. They had a point where every single contributor owned their own copyright for the contributions they made to VLC. And that was all done under GPL. I can't remember which version. Under a GPL, which meant that they had to go and get permission from every single developer in order to like say, can we use your code in a way that is, to some extent, breaks the GPL license? To which they found out, no, they couldn't. So they had a fully working app that was not shippable to the App Store for almost a year while they had to relicense the entire of VLC in order to do this kind of thing. A great example that like is very, very recent is the Swift codebase. They specifically talk about this in like some of Apple's marketing thing, in that there is no CLA for Swift. Because what they're trying to do is to try and make it so that when you contribute to this programming language, it is going to be your copyright that is included inside the Swift programming language. What this means is that Apple themselves are not a special case. So they don't have extra powers that they can then suddenly revoke all of the Swift language's like contributions so far, own them, and then say, do you know what, maybe we'll change licenses. They would have to go through and ask every single contributor, can I do something at this large scale? And they are using this as a way of saying that like Swift is going to be around for a long time. We want a lot of people from outside Apple to contribute back, and we are showing this by not having a content a CLA and forcing everyone to give us their copyright. So like by them not having a CLA, they're actively stating that they expect other people to own some of the contributions that they have. And then finally, like a third example here is Sun was bought by Oracle, and they had CLAs on all of the people that were doing contributions to Solaris, an operating system that at one point Sun open sourced. And they spent a few years under Sun as open Solaris. It was available for everyone, and all the CLAs were passed. So the moment that Oracle bought Sun, they then went and closed sourced the entire operating system. And so everyone that has spent all this time like contributing and working towards like, you know, a goal suddenly found that they were like completely shut off. Their code, because it had been given to the copyright of Sun and then Oracle, was now like completely shuttered away, and like they had no recourse because they had given away the copyrights for their code. So relicensing is a really interesting problem, but it also is the reason why you see content CLAs everywhere.
Did that kill Solaris?
I don't think that kills. I have a DVD copy of Solaris that got emailed to me. Yeah, when that came out, like when it first shipped for x86, I requested a copy and installed it on my Windows box. Didn't do anything with it
I
though.
was using on some machine, some Solaris for a long time.
Yeah.
It's great. Great operating system,
Too bad it died. Okay. Next up. Okay. This is funny because Alloy included one of the guys in the mobile team. I specifically broke his license agreement very recently about this kind of thing. Do I need to include a copyright banner on every file? No, you do not need to do it. Sometimes it's a good idea. Strictly speaking, if you include a single file that is considered the definitive license for the repo, then everything inside that repo is considered under that license. The downside of that is if the code inside it is ever like really kind of atomic, like it exists very well within itself, there's a good reason for people to like just take one of these files and put it in theirs and then not reattribute it back. So the exact example here is that we've been building plugins for our developer tool. Alloy built one that was extremely like really well built and well constructed. I wanted to build a new one, so I copied and pasted just the source file from his into mine. In the process of doing that, I completely broke his licensing because I gave no attribution. I just wrote like a little comment at the top, stolen from Alloy, and in the process of that, lost the acknowledgement and the licensing around his actual code in mine. So I then had to then go back and like actively link it back to the original license in order for me to like not be breaking someone else's license. So it's a hard one to say. If you think there's cases where you have like bits of code that specifically can be used elsewhere within the whole ecosystem of whatever the one thing you have, it can make sense to include the copyright banner on those files versus putting it on every single one, because it gets pretty lame to see them everywhere from my perspective, because that takes up a good chunk of your screen every time you're going to a new file, and it makes it effectively harder to read. So no, but a bit yes.
Seems like a practice in a lot of older projects. People are very particular about this. Contribute to GNA and have a copyright thing on top of every file. It's kind of annoying, but people like constantly try to remove other people's names from there, like replacing people's names as they add a function.
Yeah,
by their own.
Yeah, that's also really confusing. We have the same opinion in the mobile team that like we just remove those straight off from the get-go. Because like, when does it also define as like 2 people have contributed to this file? That gets really vague very quickly. I think that's all of the questions I got from Twitter. So do you all have any questions around like licensing?
Is there a difference between MIT and BSD?
I think in reality, no. I'm sure there's like specifics of something, but I don't know any of them.
So is it a valid argument to use MIT because it's shorter?
It is, in my opinion. It would be simpler. I think so on CocoaPods, the vast majority of them are MIT. I think it's somewhere on like 80% of all of our libraries are MIT. I think we default to that, and I think most people just keep it.
We haven't talked about how the license protects the author of the code.
So to what extent do you, like, what do you mean by this?
Yeah, there's most licenses have provisions about how you cannot go after the author.
You missed it. That was the
I
first
missed it.
thing.
That was the beginning?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry.
That's okay. But like the interesting aspect of that is that every license, and like every single one has the exact same statement, which is no liability and don't sue me, which is super important. Okay. If not, then we're good. Cool. All right, we're good. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Ciao. Ciao.